It was mostly a great weekend for the Orioles, a huge series win over the Phillies, but we also got some bad news. Kyle Bradish headed back to the injured list with another UCL sprain that could end his season. So the question is, what do the Orioles do without Bradish? We'll answer that question coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Orioles fans, today is Tuesday, June 18th, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb, and coming up on today's episode, we are going to look at what the Orioles are going to do without Kyle Bradish. He is back on the injured list with a UCL sprain. We don't have all the details yet, but things are pointing to at least another extended absence for one of the Orioles' top starting pitchers. What will Bradish do? What does his future look like? What will the impact be on the Orioles' rotation? Do they have enough in this current rotation? Do they need to go out and add at the deadline? And who could some of those potential additions be? We'll get to all of that, plus some injury updates on Dean Kremer, Coby Mayo, and Jackson Holliday. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. So that was the big news of the weekend. As we sit here on Tuesday, Orioles coming off of their one and only off day in the month of June, which means for the only time here in June on the Locked On Orioles podcast, I will not be recapping an Orioles game in the first segment. Yeah, Monday was their only off day before they head to New York for a pivotal series against the Yankees that starts tonight. But they are going to be without, in this series, one of their best starting pitchers, and potentially going to be without this guy for a while. Now, I broke it down briefly on Monday's episode, but if you didn't miss it, missed the news over the weekend, Kyle Bradish is back on the injured list. The Orioles placed him on Saturday morning on the 15-day IL with another UCL sprain in his right elbow. Now, what happened was basically this. Bradish started Friday night against the Phillies, and he was pitching fairly well. He did give up a leadoff homer, which was his first home run of the season that he's allowed, but the velo was actually up on all of his pitches. He had allowed 2 runs and thrown 74 pitches through 5 innings, a spot where clearly he was going to at least come back out and pitch the 6th against that Philly order. And then at the top of the 6th inning, or I guess it was the bottom of the 5th inning, we saw Keegan Aiken furiously warming in the Orioles bullpen. I told you, Bradish has been out of this game, and not just because he's tired or his day is done. Now, his velo was up, which is a good sign. He was also throwing way more sinkers and way less sliders than we usually see. That could be a bad sign, maybe pointing to the elbow was bothering him. But Bradish told Brandon Hyde and Drew French and the staff that the elbow was bothering him. They took him out of the game and immediately the next morning placed him back on the IL after it showed another UCL sprain when he got MRIs. Now, the latest from Brandon Hyde has said, hey, Bradish is getting further testing. We don't have official news yet on anything, but we do know the injury history. The UCL sprain is basically the same injury he had back in January when Bradish was ramping up his throwing program, felt some pain, got the MRI. It was the partial tear. That is what a sprain is. And that's what it is again, a partial tear of the UCL. That is the tendon in the elbow where when it tears, you have to get Tommy John surgery. But with the partial tear, Bradish opted for the rest and the PRP injection, and it actually worked. And in early May, he returned off the injured list and was pitching for the Orioles. And he was pitching great. I mean, I was worried back then that he was going to get Tommy John, was going to be done for a year and a half. And there's been a few pitchers where the rest in the PRP has worked. For most guys, it doesn't. But it seemed like it was working for Bradish. He came back. He made 8 starts. He had a 2.75 ERA. In 39 innings, he allowed only 27 hits. He had one of the lowest just average exit velocities and hard hit percentages against him in baseball. 53 strikeouts to 15 walks and just 2 homers. They were both hit Friday night against Bradish. In these 8 starts, he had been better than he was all of last year when he finished 4th in AL Cy Young voting. That's how good he had been returning from the injury. And you're like, maybe that treatment did help avoiding the surgery and he's fine. But even with that, I was always, I'm sure a lot of you were always just kind of on pins and needles about Bradish because, even if that tear had healed, there's still something there that you're worried about. And that something popped up again in the start on Friday night. Now, I don't know exactly how this is generally treated if there's another partial tear, if guys can go for the rest and the PRP injection again, and if it can work again. I'd have to do more research on that in terms of guys getting it multiple times and coming back again. But maybe he can do it again, right? Maybe it works again. Maybe he can return in the same way he did the first time. But even if that's the case, this is kind of to put it in perspective. Even if that's the case, think about the timeline. It was at some point in January that he felt the injury throwing. Let's say it was mid-January, right? This was mid-June when he got injured this time. He returned to the mound the first week of May. So if you move that timeline to now and you just kind of do the math, he gets injured in mid-June. The math isn't very helpful for you. You're looking at a return in the first week of October. So maybe you're looking at, even if all of this goes well, he does the treatment again and it works, you get him back for the postseason. And at that point, like, he's on a little bit of a pitch count, which he was when he first showed up in May. He's not maybe 110% go time, which is when you want a guy to be like that in the playoffs. So even if it's not Tommy John, it's like, and maybe all goes incredibly well, do you get him back like late September, early October? How much does that help you? It certainly helps you in the postseason. It's better than nothing. But even without Tommy John, the rest of his season is in danger with this injury if you're just going off of the timeline it took earlier this year to recover from a similar thing. Now, we don't know, right? The tear could be larger. It could be smaller than it was back in January. It could be a very different timeline. But if you're just going off that, that feels like one of the better scenarios here. And that is still worrisome. It's still helpful to the O's if he maybe came back late in the year. But even if it's not Tommy John, prognosis still not great for this to happen the second time this year. And if he does need Tommy John surgery, which feels like it's even more on the table now than it was back in January and February, he's obviously out for the rest of the 2024 season. The Orioles don't get him at all. And at the very least, he'll miss the entire first half of 2025. And then you're looking at a timeline some point. I mean, you'd hope for August of 2025, you get Bradish back for the last 2 months of next year and the playoff run. Like, that's the hope when you're looking at this timeline. What that tells me is that maybe, just maybe, he would push again for the rest and the PRP injection, because when you get into June and July, you get into the kind of middle part of the season thinking about getting Tommy John surgery. At that point, you're pushing towards the timeline of, hey, if I wait even a little bit and I get this around here, I'm giving up most of this season and honestly most of next season. We are almost at the point timeline-wise for Tommy John surgery recovery where if you get it, say, July 1st versus if you get it September 1st, in both cases, you're missing the rest of this year, most, if not all of next year, and then you are fully recovered, ready to go for open day of 2026. It's very similar to Felix Bautista at the end of last year. Remember, he had the elbow injury, but they waited a while. They tried the rest. They tried to get him throwing back, and then eventually just said, he's done. It was because they knew whether he got that Tommy John, September 1st, right after he got injured, or he got it the first week of October when he actually got the surgery, he was going to be out for all of 2025, but was going to be ready to go opening day 2020, or excuse me, out all of 2024, but was going to be ready to go opening day of 25. And that's why the Orioles waited around. It's a different timeline. We're in June and not August here for Bradish, but that could go into the thinking. Now, I did see some talk about, the Orioles should have just had him get the Tommy John back in January, the first time around. Like, yes, he would have missed all of this season, but he would have been pitching for most of 2025. And that's when the O's needed him most, because they probably won't have Corbin Burnes. I get that. And when we first heard about the first injury back in February, I talked a little bit about how I generally like when guys just go and get the surgery because there's such a much higher success rate now. And, you can fix the problem as soon as you see it. But I also understand the other side of that, which is surgery is not successful for everyone. And if you can avoid it, you should. And the other part of that argument is, shouldn't 2024 be the year you feel like you can really go and do it? In terms of Corbin Burnes, okay, if you're only going to have him for this year, if he's signing elsewhere in the offseason, well, this should be the year you're trying to go and get a World Series. And even these 8 starts, if all the Orioles get from Kyle Bradish this year is these 8 starts, that has helped them towards a World Series because they were 8 great starts and he was fantastic when he was out there for the O's. And listen, he chose the rehab and the PRP injection, and it worked. It got him back on the mound, and he was pitching better than he was last year. Now, you could argue it didn't work long term. He's back on the injured list, but at least it worked for a while, and we don't know how connected the last injury was to this one. That is all still things we are waiting to find out. And it's still a waiting game here on Kyle Bradish. We don't know all the details. This could be, maybe it's super small. It's 6 weeks to 2 months and he's back. Maybe it's he gets the Tommy John surgery tomorrow. We just don't know at this point. And I get it. It's becoming frustrating. You want to blame someone. You've got Tyler Wells and John Means already having undergone this season-ending elbow surgery this year. You had it happen to Felix Bautista last year. It's potentially on the track for happening to Kyle Bradish as well. Those are 4 very, very important pitchers to the Orioles that they may not have. They're not going to have 3 of them. They may not have all 4 of them for this stretch run this year. This is not an Orioles problem. This is not some kind of strength and conditioning pitching coach situation. Like, look around the league. Look how many serious elbow issues and serious UCL injuries and Tommy John surgeries are happening across baseball. It's going up and up every single year, and there's a lot of factors. Higher velocity puts more strain on that ligament. The human body is not meant to throw like a baseball pitcher does. It's not meant to do that movement. Every throw you make puts more and more strain on your elbow, and it feels like for most guys, something is eventually going to snap. That's just, especially with guys with high velocity, just feels like something eventually is going to happen. And it seems like it has come for Bradish. It is an issue with the velocities. It is an issue with, pitching year round when you're a youth pitcher. It could be the pitch clock. It could be, the hunt for it's a lot of different things, I think, personally playing into the epidemic of these elbow injuries now, but it's not an Orioles thing. It's a league-wide thing. Listeners to this podcast know how much I love Kyle Bradish and how good I think he is. And he showed it in those 8 starts he gave us. And it's going to be a brutal blow to the Orioles to lose him. And I hope it's not super serious and he can come back this year. I just feel like with this being the second time, my hopes are already not super up. I was already on pins and needles. And at this point, I'm kind of in the mindset of like, he's done till the second half of next year, and anything the Orioles get from him from now until then would be a huge bonus. It's unfortunate, but is the nature of pitching in Major League Baseball. But that is kind of the next question, the next point. Okay, what do the Orioles do now? Even if Bradish can return at some point this year, like he's going to miss some extended time here, even if he does come back and does avoid Tommy John. So what do the Orioles do in the interim? I'll try to answer that question with a look at the current rotation depth and who's out there to add. That's coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Game Time. This is the place to go and get tickets to Orioles games because Game Time is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. What I love about Game Time is that it's just so easy to get Orioles tickets. Now, it wasn't super easy this weekend because the yard was basically sold out all 3 games against the Phillies. But if you're looking to next week when the O's return home, there's some great deals on time. And you can even wait until the last minute. You can buy them on your way to the yard. The tickets will be right on your phone. You scan them at the gate on the Game Time app. It's that easy. And you can save up to 60% off buying last-minute Orioles tickets. So take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONMLB. That is LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. And today's episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by Supply House. You can get supplies from the site that's made for the skilled trades, supplyhouse.com. Supplyhouse.com is the reliable way to order plumbing, HVAC, and electrical products online. Their easy-to-use website is packed with helpful resources and the latest product info to help you get the job done right. Shop a complete inventory of over 200,000 parts from over 400 top brands to get your order delivered right to your door with fast shipping from coast to coast. And if you need help with an order, you can get expert support and industry-leading service from the friendliest folks in the business and talk to a real person every time. Pros in the skilled trades can even get a competitive edge by joining SupplyHouse.com's free Trademaster program. Every Trademaster gets access to a dedicated phone line, free shipping, and discounts on every order. Join the thousands of trade pros already benefiting from their free membership at supplyhouse.com/TM and order plumbing, HVAC, and electrical supplies from anywhere with just a few clicks at supplyhouse.com. So with Kyle Bradish out for, at this point, an undetermined amount of time, the next question becomes whether he misses 2 months or 2 years. What do the Orioles do next in their rotation without him? Because he has been an incredibly huge part of this O's rotation for the last 2 seasons or so. So without Kyle Bradish, this is a look, I guess, right now at the Orioles starting rotation depth. Number 1, Corbin Burnes. Number 2, Grayson Rodriguez. We know that they are still set in stone. They're still there for the O's. Then I think it would go Cole Irvin at 3, at least the way they're pitching now. Dean Kremer at 4, Albert Suarez at 5, Cade Povich at 6, Chayce McDermott, who's still in AAA, at 7, and Julio Teheran, the veteran who the Orioles brought back on a minor league deal. He's also in AAA, and he would be number 8. Those would be, if the Orioles don't make any additions, the 8 starting pitchers they would basically have at their disposal to cover the rest of the starts for this season, for a little over half of the regular season left. Now, right now, it would seem they'll go for a 5-man rotation for a little bit. You know, they had a 6-man rotation going. They lose Bradish. We'll see what they do. Dean Kremer should be back by the end of June from his tricep injury. He already pitched on rehab on Sunday. We'll get to that a little bit later. So he will factor in. Do they go back to 6? Do they still make it 5? But I will say this. If the Orioles, they get Dean Kremer back and that entire group then stays healthy the rest of the way, I think those 8 is a solid enough group to at least get you through the season and into the playoffs. Now, we know this series coming up tonight is huge. The Orioles are a game and a half back of the Yankees at this point. They got a 3-game series with them. It's June, but the Orioles are also over 10 games up on the Red Sox, who I believe right now are the first team out of the wild card picture. That is the team that's really chasing them for a playoff spot right now. And that lead can be lost, but I feel pretty confident. Like, every site has the Orioles 90+% odds to make the postseason at this point. The division race is going to be great, but I'm fairly confident the Orioles, at least at this point, are going to make the 2024 postseason. And I think some of that is because not just the record and what they've built up, but also even without Wells, without Means, without Bradish, they have a rotation and have depth here that can still get them there with the great defense they play and the great offense and a bullpen they'll hopefully build to at the deadline as well. And shout out to John Mioli, who had a great column in the Baltimore Banner on Monday, kind of talking about what the Orioles do without Bradish. And the big stat that was in there was the Orioles starting pitchers, besides the games that John Means, Tyler Wells, and Kyle Bradish have started. Of course, all 3 of those guys injured right now. All 3 could be out for the year. We know 2 of them are in Wells and Means. The Orioles pitchers not named those 3 who have started games, they have a 2.88 combined ERA this season. That is pretty good. That would be one of the best rotations in all of baseball. So I'm still trusting the group that the Orioles have left over. Now, I mentioned right now, Burnes, Rodriguez, Irvin, Suarez, Povich is the rotation. We'll see what happens when Kremer comes back soon. But when you look at a playoff rotation, it does start to shrink, right? You do not need 5 starting pitchers to get through the playoffs. You can arguably get through with 3 go-to starting pitchers and then a 4th who might have to start a couple of games, but then can help you out of the bullpen. You kind of need like 3.5 true starters and then a good bullpen to get through an entire postseason and win a World Series. So we know Corbin Burnes is the ace. If healthy, he's your number 1 guy. We know Grayson Rodriguez now is your number 2 if he stays healthy as well. But the big question without Bradish and without Means is, okay, who is that number 3 right now? Because you can get by with maybe not an untrustworthy number 4, but a shakier number 4 who can give you some good starts, some not. It's much harder to get by without a solid number 3. Now, to be fair, the Diamondbacks went to the World Series last year without a number 3. They relied on Zach Gallen as their number 1, Merrill Kelly as their number 2, and then the other games would be like bullpen games. Sometimes Brandon Pfaadt could be the starter, but he was really inconsistent. Like, they basically went with 2.5 starters and got to the World Series. So you can do it. And I think with Burnes, Rodriguez, and all this depth, the Orioles could get there, but it's really nice, really, really nice to have that 3rd guy. Rangers did a weird way last year where they had all these moving parts. I mean, Montgomery was great, but other than that, it was like plugging and playing. They did it a different way. So 2 interesting rotations got to the World Series last year. It can be done different ways, but you feel much better when you have that 3rd guy. And even like when you look at it like this, when you start an ALDS, you need at least 3 starters. Like, the guy who starts game 1 can't start game 3. He can start game 4. He can't start game 3. You need at least 3 starting pitchers in that first postseason series. So you go Burnes game 1, Grayson game 2. And then becomes the question, who do you go game 3? Right now, I think I would give the ball to Cole Irvin in a game 3 among the Orioles' healthy starting pitchers. Even if we're counting a healthy Dean Kremer, I'm still giving it to Cole Irvin. And then maybe using like Dean Kremer as that fourth guy who swings back and forth between the rotation and the bullpen in the playoffs. And there's time for all these other guys to prove themselves, McDermott, Povich, and even a guy like Suarez to maybe push themselves into that number 3 role. But that gets me to my other point with this rotation. Like, you can get to the postseason with these guys they have. You can try and win the World Series with the guys they have. It's still not awful, even without the guys that they have lost. But I think if you really do lose Bradish for long-term / for the rest of the year, at the very least, I think the Orioles will add one starting pitcher at the deadline. Now, it goes without saying they're going to add at least one, maybe 2 relievers. But I think at this point, without Bradish, you got to add a starting pitcher. And there's really 2 different ways to do that, I would say. Number one is you add a depth guy who kind of helps you cover innings, helps you get to the postseason, and then maybe he helps you in the postseason as a starter. Maybe he just becomes more of a reliever in the postseason, still helps you there, but he's really about getting to the postseason. That was the idea when the Orioles acquired Jack Flaherty at the deadline last year. It just didn't work out. Number 2 is you add more of a top guy who easily slots into your top 3, and you go with Burns, Grayson, and that pitcher, and you just roll at him with a really, really strong top 3. Someone who better replaces the production, say, of Kyle Bradish. Now, I personally think the Orioles will push closer to category 1. And here's why. Here's some of the names that could be available. We don't know, but could be available at the trade deadline and could fit into that category 1 of more of that depth guy, comes into your rotation for the rest of the regular season, helps you out, but you don't know if he's going to be a playoff starter. He'll be on your playoff roster, but he's more about getting you there. And then, we'll see how he pitches in the second half and make the decision there. Trevor Williams of the Nats is currently on the IL with a flexor strain, but he does have a 2.22 ERA in 11 starts. He's a rental as well. Should be fairly cheap. The A's Paul Blackburn has a fracture in his foot, but he's slowly making his way back. 4.11 ERA in 8 starts. He's got a year and a half of team control. Erick Fedde of the White Sox coming back from Korea this year and pitching really well. 3.09 ERA in 15 starts. He's been great. I'm still not convinced because he was really bad his first time around in the majors, but also has a year and a half of team control. Tyler Anderson, a 2.58 ERA in 14 starts, the left-hander for the Angels. It's kind of smoke and mirrors for him. It's a lot of walks. It's not a lot of strikeouts, but the ERA is down. I don't think he's as good as ERA says, but he's still a good pitcher that can help you. And again, controlled for a year and a half. The righty Cal Quantrill of the Rockies used to be with the Guardians. 3.30 ERA in 14 starts. That's pretty good in Coors Field. Now, he doesn't really strike a lot of guys out, which concerns me, but he gets soft contact, and he's got a year and a half of team control. And then 2 guys from the Mets, the veteran lefty Jose Quintana, been around the block, 14 starts, a 4.98 ERA, but he is a rental and can help you. And then Luis Severino, a bounce-back season, signing the 1-year deal with the Mets. I wanted the Orioles to go after him this offseason, but does have a 3.12 ERA in 13 starts this season and also would be a fairly cheap rental. So those are all the guys who I think, if the O's traded for them, would slot into one of the 5 spots in their rotation and help them down the stretch. Then you turn to the other category, more of the, big time name, definitely in your top 3 of your rotation, definitely a playoff starter kind of guys. Maybe Jesus Luzardo. We know the Orioles targeted him this offseason, but he's got a 5.00 ERA in 12 starts. We know he has a better track record, but do you want to go after him now with the struggles he's had? Garrett Crochet, the lefty for the White Sox, has been great. A 3.16 ERA in 15 starts. He's got 2.5 years of control, but this is his first year as a starter, and it's coming off Tommy John. There's got to be an innings limit he hits at some point. Not sure you can trust him to be a starter the rest of the season. Yusei Kikuchi for the Blue Jays has been great. 3.26 ERA in 14 starts. He is a rental. The Blue Jays might trade him if they fall out of contention, but are they really going to trade him in division to the Orioles? And then the other 2 names are like, if the Astros really want to sell, Justin Verlander, who's having an okay year, and then Framber Valdez, who's also taken a little bit of a step back and dealt with some injuries this year as well. So you kind of look at that list, and clearly the names I said in the second list are better than most of the names in the first list, but the gap between the 2 is not huge, and there are so many more options and honestly cheaper options in that first category where I just don't think that stud ace starting pitcher is really out there to go get at this year's deadline. It's not as much of the Orioles aren't willing to spend for it. It's like that player might not be available, because the other thing is there's so many teams still in it. And I get we're in mid-June. We're still 6 weeks away from the trade deadline. A lot could change. but there's so many teams in the National League. There are like 9 teams separated by 2 games that are all like around or under 500, but are still very much alive for a wild card spot. A couple of those teams might sell, but a lot of them won't because they can still get into the playoffs. There's just a weird middle of the standings right now. There might not be a lot of sellers. It might not be a lot of pitchers out there. So I do think the Orioles would rather just kind of go for that first group. And basically, I would think you'd add one of those guys, like say it is Luis Severino. I think Jim Bowden wrote in a piece today that he would love to see the Orioles go after Severino. It wasn't any like reporting. It was just him saying this would make sense. Say it's Luis Severino. I think he easily slots in as a top 5 Orioles starter. He helps get you to the postseason. And then when you get to the playoffs, you have Burns and Rodriguez 1 and 2. And then you basically assess, okay, how is Irvin pitching? How is Suarez pitching? How does Povich look? Is McDermott here? How's Kremer looking? How's Severino looking? And you decide between all of those guys, okay, somebody's going to be our number 3 starter. Somebody's going to be that swing number 4 man. A couple of you are going to definitely be in the bullpen. And we're going to go from there in more of that Rangers Diamondbacks approach. And it can work. We saw it work last year. I just think that's the way they'll go. I think it's highly unlikely they go and get like a stud number 1, number 2. But I think at this point, they're going to go get somebody from that first group of guys. And there could be other guys that become available as we get closer to the deadline as well. But we still have a lot of time to figure it out. And this will give more runway to guys like Povich and to guys like Albert Suarez to prove in the next 6 weeks. You know, can they hold up? Do the Orioles maybe not even need to make a trade? And they have enough depth right now. But they are getting one of those starters back pretty soon. That is Dean Kremer. And coming up next to finish off the show, get you some injury updates on him and others in the final segment. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by Prize Picks. To me, the most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. How do you play at Prize Picks? Well, you just make a lineup in as little as 60 seconds. You pick more or less on the stat projections from Prize Picks on anywhere from 2 to 6 players. It can be something as easy as, oh, you know, it is the Orioles game, and let's say Grayson Rodriguez is pitching more or less than 7.5 strikeouts. I'll take more. He pitches and strikes out more. You win. It's super, super easy. And if you're looking for promotions, Prize Picks has you covered every week. They lower select player stat projections on Tuesdays, which increases your chance of getting a win. So check it out. That is Tuesday right now. They've got the NBA action. They've got the NHL action. They've got everything over there at Prize Picks. So download the app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, download the Prize Picks app today, use code LOCKEDONMLB, and get a first deposit match up to $100 at Prize Picks. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy. So to finish things off here on today's episode, it's tough news with Kyle Bradish, but we got some good news starting pitching-wise over the weekend. Dean Kremer is inching closer to returning to the Orioles rotation. He's been out for a while now with a tricep injury. Mike Elias, when he spoke to the media a couple weeks ago, basically said that he expects Kremer back before the end of June, and that seems like we are on track for that because Kremer appeared in his first rehab outing in AAA Norfolk on Sunday. Pitched 3 2/3 innings, allowing 5 runs, but only 2 of them earned on 4 hits, struck out 3 and walked 1. He threw 59 pitches in the game. Connor Newcomb made kind of a costly error in the 4th that extended that inning, allowed the 3 unearned runs to eventually score. He couldn't finish that 4th inning, but it seemed like right around 60 pitches was the goal for Kremer. Now, he threw all 5 of his pitches. Velo was a little bit down on the fastballs. You know, he got it up there a few times, but on average, he was only about 92. That's pretty normal for a first rehab start back. But what it does tell me is between the pitch count at 60 and the velocity, I would not be surprised at all if he's getting at least one more rehab start in AAA before the Orioles bring him back. Now, if it is just the one rehab start, he would be available to be activated on Friday when the Orioles go to Houston. That's as early as he'd be ready to pitch again. We haven't seen any named starters for that series, so it's possible, but I would say more than likely he pitches for Norfolk on Friday, makes at least one more rehab start. If that goes well, the Orioles target something next week, maybe next Wednesday or Thursday when they're back at home to bring Kremer back to the rotation. That would actually be my guess. I would say maybe next Thursday, June 27th. That's the guess I'm going to throw out. Pride Night, Dean Kremer returns for the Orioles would be my guess. And, you know, hasn't had the most amazing year, right? A 4.32 ERA on the season, but he's been a good, solid kind of innings eating kind of guy. And really just run-of-the-mill, solid number 5 starter that every single team needs. And at the very least, in terms of innings eating and guys that have been there, that's going to help the rotation with Kyle Bradish going down. He will slot back into a rotation spot, no doubt about that. The question will be, do they just put him back in there and go back to the 6-man rotation? He basically takes Bradish's spot, or throw Suarez back in the bullpen, maybe send Povich back down to AAA and go back to the 5-man rotation. I think they'll stay with 6 for a little bit, and then once they get out of this crazy schedule stretch in June, they'll kind of reassess that situation. 2 of the Orioles' top prospects, also with some injury news before we get out of here. Coby Mayo tonight is making his return to AAA Norfolk. He's been out since May 17th, so for about a month, after falling into the dugout trying to catch a pop-up and breaking a rib. He went on a rehab assignment to High A Aberdeen on Thursday, went 6 for 13 with 3 doubles and 3 homers in those 4 games, and they felt like, yeah, he's pretty good to go. 291 average, 359 on base, 605 slug with 13 homers in AAA this year. He's going to be back in AAA, and as long as his swing's looking good, he's getting back into the groove over the next couple of weeks with the Tides. He kind of immediately becomes a call-up option again for the O's as we get into July if they do feel like they need Mayo to boost this lineup. And the last piece of news is Jackson Holliday. He's been swinging it really well, looking really good since the demotion back to AAA, but it had to be put on pause for a little bit. Holliday, at the end of last week, was placed on the 7-day minor league injured list with right elbow inflammation. Mike Elias said they aren't very concerned at all, basically said it's just bothering a little bit. He needs to rest it for a few weeks. So, he's hitting 270 with a 433 on base, 7 homers, 54 strikeouts to 54 walks in AAA this year. The adjustments he'd made since being sent back down had been working. He'd been looking good, but he'll need to rest. To hopefully a few weeks means some point in July. Holiday's back in the AAA lineup. And then again, just like Mayo, as soon as he gets back into the groove, he becomes a call-up option again. But guys like Arias and Mateo and Westberg are making it much harder for the Orioles to bring those 2 top prospects into the big leagues. That'll do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. Of course, a gigantic series begins tonight. Yankees in the Bronx. It is a 1.5 game lead for the Yankees over the O's. This is a massive series. Albert Suarez gets the ball for the Orioles at 7:05 tonight in game 1 against the lefty Nestor Cortes with a 3.59 ERA on the season. This will certainly be a fun one, and I will be back with you tomorrow to recap everything we see from game 1 between the Orioles and the Yankees. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.